Ambassador Robert O'Brien, welcome to the Reagan Library.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Great. Well, we have a lot of ground to cover, and super excited to have this time with you. Look, you were President Trump's national security advisor from 2019 to 2021, and as someone who very much continues to be in the national conversation, what are you most excited about from a national security perspective when it comes to President Trump returning to office?
Well, it reminds me of the early days of Reagan in 1981 when we were so excited when President Reagan came in after Jimmy Carter. We've gone through a tremendous period of American weakness, and the country's not weak, and fundamentally it's strong, but we're perceived as weak by our adversaries. And now President Trump is coming back. It's like Reagan taking office after Jimmy Carter, Trump taking office after a very weak Biden administration. America's back, and I spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks talking to heads of state and heads of government, and the whole theme, that the idea that America was back under Biden and people were worried about Trump, it's just the opposite. They are so excited that President Trump is back, especially the free world, because we're going to bring freedom and liberty back to and peace back to the world through American strength.
During your time as national security advisor, you played an instrumental role in the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. What lessons should be drawn from the Abraham Accords, and how can President Trump build on that success in his new administration?
So that's a really terrific question, because the Abraham Accords just didn't happen, right? There was a big foundation, and part of that happened before I was national security advisor, where I was still the hostage envoy. And some of it happened because of our hostage work, getting to be close with NBC and the then Crown Prince, now President of the UAE. And if you develop your allies and you build political capital with your allies, you can then call on that later to get deals done. And so we did it with Israel. We moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Which has been promised.
Last time I checked, the sky didn't fall when that happened.
The sky didn't fall. We recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. With the UAE, they needed weapons to defend against Iran, and so we got them the high-tech weapons, Patriot anti-aircraft missiles and anti-drone missiles that they needed. And so when it came time to negotiate the accords, and we were getting to the short strokes, it was tough to get the parties to make concessions. We took that political capital that we built up, and President Trump spent that capital to get that deal done and push over the edge. But had we not moved the embassy, had we not given the UAE the weapons it needed to defend itself against Iran, I don't think the accords would have happened.
During your time as national security advisor, the Trump administration also persuaded many NATO allies to significantly increase their spending on their defense. What strategies were most effective as you took that on, and what more needs to be done to ensure that NATO is both effective and properly resourced?
Yeah, so we called it burden sharing, Dave, and it's, when I took office, President Trump made some what I guess you'd call unorthodox statements about NATO. He said, it's like a country club. If you don't pay your dues, you can't get a tea time. You can't dine out in the restaurant. And he was referring to the NATO countries that weren't paying the 2% of their GDP towards their own defense. And all of that caused people to say, oh, he hates NATO, he's going to withdraw from the alliance. What it did is it provoked a little bit of a mini crisis in the alliance. And so Jens Stoltenberg and I went to each of the countries in NATO, and Jens was the Secretary General of NATO at the time. And we said, this is what you got to pay. And about half of them did, a little more than half. And so we went from 4 countries paying 2% of their GDP to NATO to about 14 countries. It's now about 20. And that's because of President Trump's tough language. But it wasn't just the money that was being spent. It was a commitment to the mission of NATO. And so by the time we left Afghanistan, which was a catastrophic withdrawal, we had 2-to-1 NATO soldiers to American soldiers. We had 5,000 NATO soldiers in place in Afghanistan and only 2,500 American soldiers. So we had this burden sharing that went beyond just the financial burden sharing. It was the cost of actually completing the NATO missions. And so there was an entire about-face brought about by President Trump. And what I argue is, rather than weaken the alliance, he strengthened the alliance, through his tough, I said with the family, sometimes you have tough love with your family. If you got an addict in your family, and there were certainly addicts in NATO that were free riding on America, if you've got an addict, you got to give him tough love and get him off the drugs. We had to use tough love to get NATO to do what it was supposed to do to make us all better protected and more secure.
I'll underscore you're making a financial point, but also an attitudinal point. Yeah, that's a very interesting point that's often overlooked in the conversation about NATO. So thank you for that. Look, you've been privy to some of our nation's most sensitive secrets. You continue to engage in the national conversation. I'm curious, what are some issues, obviously at an unclassified level, that are important, but maybe not getting the kind of attention that they deserve?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, I think we'll talk about this more. The American lead in tech really depends on our private sector. If we lose our private sector advantage in tech, and we use antitrust tools, or Europe uses antitrust tools to destroy our big tech companies, that's our game against China. We're ahead of them now in AI and quantum, which are the keys to the future. But if we lose that edge, and if our big companies are destroyed or hobbled, that's a real problem.
So is that an area to watch with President Trump as he takes office, the how U.S. companies are treated, whether they're treated fairly or not by Europeans or others?
I think especially by the Europeans. I think the Europeans are going to have a very rude awakening. In fact, there could be on day one, President Trump has promised to fix it. You know, the Europeans just fined Apple $9 billion on a tax theory, and then they're going to try and charge them another $10 billion. It's reported on antitrust fines. All they're doing is the Europeans are taking money out of the U.S. economy, out of the research and development budgets of our great companies, and taking them and putting them in the European economy. That's not fair, and President Trump is not going to put up with it.
I'm going to invite you to speculate, pure speculation, of course, but what might President Trump, what are some options? If you were advising him, what are some options that he might consider?
I'll tell you an option he did consider, and the message we delivered, when the French were thinking of the digital services tax back in 2019, he sent me to Berlin. We were having a conference on Libya, but Macron was going to be there. So he said, pull Macron aside and tell President Macron that if he imposes a digital services tax on our U.S. digital companies, we're going to put a 50% tariff on French wine and champagne. And President Macron's a friend. I think he's a great leader and a good man. And I had to deliver that message. And someone took a photo of it just as I was telling him. And he didn't look very happy, and I looked a little bit awkward telling him. But guess what? There was no digital service tax because President Trump put the American people first. And he did it in a way, this is what's so amazing about President Trump that people may not realize. Those companies that he was saving, at the time, Twitter was not under Elon Musk, Facebook, Apple, Google. These were companies that were viewed as very hostile to President Trump. And yet, because they were American companies, even though they were treating him poorly and deplatforming conservatives, he still went to bat for them because they were great American companies. And that was part of America first. So we weren't going to let the French push us around. So I think that the EU is going to expect massive tariffs on cars coming in, massive tariffs on wine, cheese, other items, everything Europe exports to us. If they continue this war on American tech, they're going to get a trade war, and it's going to be one they end up losing ultimately.
A really interesting layer of what, among many of what you just flagged, is there's the threat of tariffs, which does not equal tariffs, right? Right. So that's very interesting. That's sometimes lost in the national conversation and how President Trump is talked about.
Well, people wonder how I got A$AP Rocky home, the American rapper, when I was the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. And I went to Sweden, and Sweden was prosecuting A$AP Rocky for an alleged assault. It was an unfair prosecution, we believed. And the president wanted A$AP home. And part of that is it was important to show other countries that were holding Americans wrongfully in Syria and in Iran and Turkey, that America means what it says. And so I had to sit down and have some very hard conversations with our Swedish partners at the time. They weren't allies. They weren't. This was before
not in NATO yet.
They were not NATO allies yet, but they were soon to be. But I had to sit down and tell them, look, you're not going to sell another Volvo in America if you keep A$AP Rocky. So it's your choice. But the president wants them home, and he wants to send a message that we get Americans home. Sorry that Sweden, but IKEA is not going to sell any more Swedish meatballs in their restaurant, and Volvo's not going to sell any more cars if we don't have them home. And guess what?
Reported at the time?
It was not reported at the time. Secretary Pompeo has now reported it and put it in his book. So I can talk about it since Mike already let the cat out of the bag. And guess what? A$AP came home. I was there on a Monday. I said he's got to be home on Friday. On Friday, he was on a private jet back to America. So it makes your point. It goes to show how much leverage the threat of sanctions or the threat of tariffs can give, if used correctly, can give the president.
Well, we're here in President Reagan's office at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library.
I love being here.
President Reagan said, "We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression." So today, what does peace through strength mean?
Well, look, I think what it means is, I think sometimes it's conservatives and it's Reaganites, and I think President Trump is a Reaganite. When he talks about peace through strength, he always says when they ask him what America First means, he says peace through strength. So it ties back to RWR. And I think sometimes as conservatives and as Reaganites, we kind of get, well, it means 15 aircraft carriers. It means a 600 ship Navy, or it means, 5,000 fighter jets. And those are all impressive numbers. And the military strength of America is certainly the backbone of peace through strength. But we don't build the aircraft carriers for bragging rights. It's not to say, hey, we've got more than the Chinese, so we're better. The point of having a strong military, the point of having a strong economy, of having a strong diplomatic corps at the State Department, of having, using all our soft power in a strong way, is to reap the reward. And the reward of peace through strength is peace. It's about being a peacemaker. And Ronald Reagan was a peacemaker, and President Trump was a peacemaker. And by being strong, America got the Abraham Accords. We got the Serbia-Kosovo deal. We healed the Gulf Rift. We got a good deal in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the Taliban didn't follow through, and then there was had a disastrous finale under the Biden folks, under Jake and Tony and Lloyd. But we got all the hostages home. We won the war against ISIS. All of that was a result of our strength. But the end it was peace through strength through S equals peace, and that's what we brought peace to the world, and that was that's what peace through strength means, and we've got to look at the end state as, again, not a bragging game about who's got the most nuclear weapons or the most silos or the most SLBMs. It's how do we get peace in the world, and that's stopping conflict and deterring our adversaries, but it's also where possible having things happen like the Abraham Accords.
I'll underscore one aspect of what you just shared with us is you talked about strength of our economy, right? But also by extension, the strength of our diplomacy, the strength of our intelligence community. It's not simply focused on defense, although defense is obviously existentially important. Do you think that more holistic understanding of strength is entered the national conversation?
I think it's starting to. And you know who was responsible for it? Obviously, President Trump was responsible for it, but he used to say this all the time, that economic security equals national security. But Larry Kudlow used to use that all the time, our former director of the National Economic Council, who's now got a great Fox show on every afternoon. And if you don't watch Larry, watch him. He's terrific. And President Trump watches him. So, President Trump is taking heed of what Larry says. And Larry used to always say, Mr. President, economic security is national security. And so it goes to your point that a strong economy allows us to build the military that we need, but it also allows us to do all kinds of other things around the world, to help countries that need help, to build America's lead in critical technologies beyond just, the platforms that we produce, from our big defense manufacturers.
Last question. As someone who served at the highest levels of government and as someone who is engaged at the Reagan National Defense Forum,
with you,
year after year, what does Ronald Reagan mean to you?
Well, Ronald Reagan it was almost a religion in my household. I first saw Ronald Reagan in 1976 when he was running for president. My dad took me to a Reagan rally, and we were Catholics and then Reaganites and then Republicans in that order. And I remember watching the convention in '76 and watching the floor fight and seeing my dad almost throw something at the TV because Strom Thurmond defected and went with President Ford at the time. And President Ford was a good man, but we so wanted Ronald Reagan to win in '76, and it would have maybe avoided the 4 detrimental Carter years. Although Biden's made Carter look pretty good. Carter's got Biden to thank for a lot, but his legacy certainly improved. But when Reagan came back in, America was facing malaise. We had the hostage crisis, 450 some days of Americans being held in Iran. The Soviet bear was on the march in Nicaragua and Afghanistan and in Angola and Mozambique, all through the Caribbean, Grenada. So America looked like it was in decline. It looked like it was done. And Ronald Reagan came back in and restored. It truly became Morning America, and he restored, our belief in the country and our belief that we could do anything. We could win the Cold War. I mean, Reagan being asked about how does the Cold War win, and he said, "We win, they lose." I mean, what a better, as a young man or young woman watching in 1981, watching that revolution take place, it was an exciting time for the country. And I was lucky. My first job out of high school, I went back and worked at the RNC, and then I was a page to the Republican National Convention in Dallas in '84, and was on the floor when President Reagan and Vice President Bush were renominated, and so it means the world to me. And And so to be able to serve in the same seat that, that people like Judge Clark and Dick Allen and Admiral Poindexter served in, under President Trump, who had a belief similar to Ronald Reagan that peace through strength was a way for America to keep to deter our foes and build respect from our adversaries. That foundation as a youth, leading me to be able to serve in that role, is something that was very meaningful to me. And every time I looked around the office, I thought about Ronald Reagan when I walked in, and then seeing President Trump implement Reagan's policies, and to see the amazing results we got from those policies was really, it was something special, a real privilege.
Well, thank you for that, Ambassador Robert O'Brien. We really appreciate you being here at the Reagan National Defense Forum.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, David.